Just days after the Orioles lost one of their co-hitting coaches, the other one has now decided to leave the organization as well, as Matt Borgschulte is headed to the Minnesota Twins to become their hitting coach next season. I'll break down the fallout for the Orioles coaching staff from this move, plus get to some other Orioles news and notes coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Wednesday, October 16th, 2024, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we're going to run through some Orioles news and notes, including the big one from earlier this week. Matt Borgschulte, the Orioles co-hitting coach for the last 3 seasons, leaving to rejoin the Minnesota Twins, where he will now be their hitting coach in 2025 and beyond. We'll talk about the fallout for the Orioles as they have now lost both of their co-hitting coaches this offseason and what that means for their quest to find some new ones going into next year. And then some other Orioles news and notes, including one of their catchers who played for the big league team this year, returning on a minor league deal, and a couple of guys electing free agency who I think the O's should consider trying to bring back next season. But that's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. Just place your first $5 bet, and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Just visit FanDuel.com to get started today. So the big news we're talking about here is Matt Borgschulte. And you may have listened to Tuesday's episode. If you haven't, make sure to go back and check that one out from yesterday. Of course, you can watch right here on the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. You can also listen wherever you get your podcast. Make sure to leave a 5-star rating and a review wherever you listen as well. That really, really helps out the show. But you might have noticed, as I was talking on Tuesday's episode, which I did record over the weekend, that why is Connor mentioning Matt Borgschulte is still an Orioles hitting coach? That is no longer the case. Well, that news breaking on Monday evening. I had already recorded Tuesday's episode. But yeah, so after last week, when Orioles co-hitting coach Ryan Fuller decided to leave the organization, and then the O's parted ways with bench coach Freddie Gonzalez and Major League coach Jose Hernandez, usually all those moves, the coaching moves, are done at one time. So I figured, okay, all 3 of these are going to be the only coaching moves. But you got to consider guys getting actively hired away by other organizations. And that is what happened on Monday, as the Orioles' remaining co-hitting coach in Matt Borgschulte was hired by the Minnesota Twins to be their hitting coach next season. Now, for Borgschulte, this is a bit of a homecoming. He was hired by the Twins as a minor league hitting coach all the way back in 2018 and climbed through their organization, made it as the AAA hitting coach in 2021. And that was his final job before the Orioles hired him. They hired Borgschulte in the winter after the 2021 season, also promoted Ryan Fuller, and made the 2 of them co-hitting coaches, jobs they held for the next 3 seasons, 22, 23, and 24, before both of them decided to go in other directions after this year. And that's kind of an important part to know here. Neither Fuller nor Borgschulte were fired. You know, despite tough offensive stretch to finish the season, obviously for the Orioles, specifically in those big spots, the struggles with runners in scoring position, Mike Elias talked about maybe making some changes, but they did not push out Fuller or Borgschulte. They both left on their own accord. Fuller hasn't gotten a job lined up yet, but all the reporting surrounding it from Andy Koska of the Baltimore Banners that he left, it was his own decision. The Orioles were willing to bring him back. And the fact that Borgschulte, 4 days after all of that happened, took another job and wasn't named initially, tells me the Orioles were willing to bring him back too, but he is off to his old organization and gets a chance with a team he knows even better than the Orioles, was with them for longer, to be, at least at this point, one of their hitting coaches. The Twins had let go of both of their hitting coaches, Rudy Hernandez and Derek Showman, after this very, very disappointing season in Minnesota ended. Now they bring back Borgschulte to lead that group in 2025. But this does have a ripple effect on this Orioles clubhouse, on this Orioles dugout, because now you're not just replacing one guy on the hitting staff, you are replacing 2. Now, it seems like to this point, Cody Ashy, who has been with the O's organization for a couple of years, was like the offensive strategist basically for the Orioles in the dugout for the last 2 seasons, kind of operated, it seemed like, as a third hitting coach anyway. So I would not at all be surprised if Ashy gets promoted to a co-hitting coach role next year. You at least have some continuity from Cody Ashy being in that role. And then we'll see what the O's do. I would think they will still have some sort of 3-man hitting coaching staff next year. So my guess would be there's one promotion from the Orioles minor league system, someone who has grown up with these prospects and helped coach them at the minor league level who gets promoted. Someone like a Sherman Johnson or a Brink Ambler or, Mike Montville or one of these guys. And then my other guess would be the Orioles do still make an outside the organization hire, probably someone that I mentioned on Tuesday's episode when I came up with about 10 or so candidates from outside the organization that the O's could target for one of these hitting coach jobs. So Borgschulte leaving obviously changed some. It doesn't change a lot about what I talked about in yesterday's episode, though. All of those other candidates still in play, and now there's just one extra job opening for one of those guys to potentially get. But, this, again, I feel like I said what I need to say on Tuesday's episode. So again, check that one out if you haven't already. But even with both of the co-hitting coaches gone now, it's not going to overhaul an Orioles hitting philosophy. It's just not going to happen. They're more so going to look for, okay, can we get a different face, a different voice in the room that's going to better get across our message? And maybe they will make some tweaks in terms of how they approach things, especially in those big spots with runners in scoring position. But I've said it again and again and again. I'll continue to say it, maybe not as much as I have been over the past week or so, that they're not going to turn into a team that plays small ball. They're not going to bunt. They have the second fewest sacrifice bunts in baseball this year. It's not a good way to score runs anyway. They're not going to change those kinds of things. They're still going to be aggressive. They're still going to go up looking to do damage every time they step to the plate. But maybe there are some things that can help them in that approach in those big situations to rise to the moment and not crumble like they did sometimes, and then especially in the last 2 postseasons as well. And maybe some new voices or some new faces can come in and help them do that while still maintaining a level that made them overall a top 5 offense in baseball in 2024. Combining those two things makes this team truly a World Series contender going into next year. And I know there's also a couple of issues people are having with the hitting coaches, these moves, whatever it may be. One of them I haven't seen as much, but was chatting with some of the people that cover the team on a more day-to-day basis. And, there was a good live show that I was at with the Orioles on the Verge guys on Monday night at Checker Spot Brewing, where this came up a couple of times as well, where a lot of people just can't seem to grasp the fact of the Orioles just purely having 2 hitting coaches, whether it's Borgschulte or Fuller or Ashy or whomever it is in those roles in that dugout. Go look at any other team across Major League Baseball, the other 29 organizations. I will guarantee you that, I'll give myself a little leeway, at least 27 of the other 29 and probably more have at the very least a hitting coach and an assistant hitting coach in that dugout. And about half of the other teams, if not more, have the co-hitting coach situations that the Orioles have. Like, look at the team with the best offense in baseball who's in the NLCS right now, the Los Angeles Dodgers. They've got co-hitting coaches in that dugout right now. That is how things operate. It's a lot of work to do. John Mioli had a good piece about this in the Baltimore Banner on Tuesday, about all the things that these hitting coaches do behind the scenes. Is not just about teaching, which is a big part of it. It is also about the game planning and preparation and getting these guys plans of attack against every single certain pitcher they could face in every single series across a 162 game season. It is a lot of prep work. And that is why you want 2 or 3. Some teams even have 4 members of their major league coaching staff just focused on hitting to make sure they are as prepared as possible. Like, there's a lot of like, why do they even have 2 hitting coaches? Why? Look around Major League Baseball. Like, just look around. Just all you got to do is pull up an MLB.com coaching staffs page, and you'll see the co-hitting coaches across the board with a lot of teams as well. And I think the other thing that I'm seeing some, and this is more ignorance from people more than anything else, but just, why are you having hitting coaches that didn't play in the big leagues? Borgschulte and Fuller did not. Cody Ashy did. He played 5 years with the Phillies and other teams. Why aren't you bringing in Terry Crowley? I promise you right now, Terry Crowley is not going to be the Orioles hitting coach. I'm promising you that is not going to happen. But why aren't you bringing in, bring back, it could be anyone like Adam Jones or Nick Markakis or JJ Guy. It doesn't even have to be an Orioles player, guys who have had success. That comments like that are a fundamental misunderstanding of what it takes to be a coach or what it takes to be a teacher. And a lot of coaching is teaching, not all of it. I think there's probably more teaching at the minor league level than there is the major league level, but still, it's all coaches, and most coaches start at the minors before they get to the majors. Fundamental misunderstanding. If you think a guy's major league stats or minor league stats or college baseball stats or whatever it may be, or the fact that they even have stats beyond high school at all, if you think that has more than a maybe 1% impact on their ability to coach the game of baseball, you have a complete misunderstanding, again, of what it means to be a coach and what it means to be a teacher of anything. Again, the Dodgers, best offense in baseball. Yeah, is it because they have Ohtani, Betts, and Freeman? Sure. But they have turned a lot of hitters into something better than they should be over there. And Robert Van Skyok, their lead hitting coach, has been there for years. His baseball career ended as a average player on a community college team. That's as far as he got as a baseball hitter. Never even played professionally. And he is the hitting coach helping Freddie Freeman, Mookie Betts, and Shohei Ohtani try to win a World Series title, and it's working. It just being good at something does not mean you will be a good teacher. And on the flip side, being bad at something does not mean you're going to be a bad teacher. Those skills do not intersect. That's just a fundamental misunderstanding of think of your college history professor who taught your class about the Industrial Revolution. They weren't alive for the Industrial Revolution, but they're still great at teaching it, probably. Maybe not a one-to-one comparison, but you don't have to be a big league all-star to be a great hitting coach. You need to be a good teacher. You need to have philosophies. You need to know how to use data. You need to know how to interact with players, how to get your message across. You don't have to be a 15-year big leaguer headed to the Hall of Fame to be able to do that. That's. I think most people know that, but I just wanted to get that out there, as the Orioles will probably hire someone who probably didn't play a lot in the big leagues or maybe did not at all. That's not really how it goes when you're looking at major league hitting coaches. But that is that. The Orioles' 2 co-hitting coaches are out. There's going to be potentially 2 new faces in that hitting room going into 2025. But the Orioles had some other kind of smaller news and notes come out over the past few days or weeks. Some things that came out recently, some things that I missed that I wanted to get to quickly, to get to those on the next couple episodes, or excuse me, the next couple segments of this episode, including coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. Now, NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets, guaranteed, when you place your first $5 bet. Now listen, the Ravens continue to play some real good football. So they play Monday night against the Buccaneers, especially against Baker Mayfield. Yeah, I'm taking the Ravens to cover in that one. And you can do that at FanDuel.com. So the next piece of Orioles news and notes I wanted to get to is that David Banuelos is returning to the Orioles on a minor league deal. Bañuelos, who was signed by the O's on a minor league deal last offseason after he had been with the Minnesota Twins for a good chunk of his minor league career. He comes in and he did make his major league debut, which was pretty cool. Pinch hit in a game in April, did fly out. That was the only game he appeared in this year in the big leagues. But it was an awesome moment for him. And Brandon Hyde talked about it after that game, how cool it was to get him into a baseball game. But he was mostly used as the taxi squad catcher this year. What is the taxi squad catcher? Well, that's a guy who travels you around both for home and away games. And it's usually not the same player for all 162 games. Most teams rotate between 2 and 3 different guys who serve as their taxi squad catchers throughout the year. That's basically a catcher who travels with the team who is not on the active roster. But because catchers are such a specified position, and it's basically to say, okay, say a catcher gets injured in warmups or gets injured during a series on the West Coast, and it's really hard to get another catcher out there quickly because you do not want to be operating in a baseball game with one active catcher. That could be disaster time. So it allows you to travel someone with the team who, if something happens, you can immediately activate that taxi squad catcher to the roster and make sure you have two healthy catchers every time you play. And David Banuelos, who had played some at the AAA level last year with the Twins, but had never made the major leagues, had spent a lot of time in AA over the past few years, got the brunt of that role. Again, he wasn't with the Orioles every day. He still played in 22 AAA games, had 86 plate appearances, and posted a 96 WRC plus with the Norfolk Tides this year. But again, it was sporadic throughout the season, not a lot of time with Norfolk because he spent so much time as that taxi squad catcher. And he seemed to really fit in with the Orioles clubhouse. And again, it's an interesting role. You become kind of an elevated bullpen catcher when you're not active in that role. You're catching a lot of pitchers on the road and at home. You're doing a lot of brunt work. And you hope you get that one chance that Bañuelos got in April this year. But overall, you kind of always see him in the dugout, in the hoodie and the hat, and dapping guys up and having a good time. Like, he seemed to really fit in that Orioles clubhouse and in that dugout. And to me, that seems like a perfect reason to bring a guy back on another minor league deal. He gets an invite to big league spring training next year. If the Orioles were to decide to not bring back James McCann, their backup catcher, who is a free agent this winter, then maybe Bañuelos in big league spring training could have a chance to compete for that backup catcher job next spring. But realistically, they're going to upgrade from him if they do lose McCann to be Adley's backup next year. But I think Banuelos is your perfect, once again, taxi squad catcher for next season. I think someone like Blake Hunt, who came over in the Mike Bauman trade this year, who's actually currently on the 40-man roster, probably a much better chance if McCann's not back to go into spring training and fight for the backup catcher role. But if Hunt doesn't get it, so this is the other great thing about Banuelos. Like for Hunt, the Orioles have a little bit invested in him. They think he has a little bit of a future, maybe could be the backup catcher. They would want him, if he's not on the active roster, to be in AAA and getting playing time and splitting time with Samuel Basallo next year and getting on the field. Whereas it's not that they don't think Banuelos has any future, but again, he's almost 30. They kind of know what he is at this point. He's a defense first catcher, not much of a bat, especially when you're looking at being a major league ready bat at any point. And a guy who can help you out in different ways. And I just kind of love that they didn't even let Banuelos become a free agent, right? He wouldn't have technically become a minor league free agent until after the World Series ended. They didn't even wait that long. They just said, hey, do you want to come back on a minor league deal? And apparently he loved it that much that he did want to. It's not going to make much of an impact on the field for the 2025 Major League Orioles, but he could get into a game or two if he's in this same taxi squad role. But it just feels like a really good way of rewarding this guy who probably did a lot of grunt work for your team this year, seemed to fit in well, and to bring him back to do the same thing is definitely cool for David Banuelos. But again, I don't see him being in a spot to really compete for that backup catcher job in Sarasota next year. I would really like to see the Orioles bring back James McCann, maybe a 1 year, $5, $6, $7 million deal for next year, a guy who was huge in the clubhouse, who wasn't the most productive hitter and wasn't the most amazing defensive catcher, but kind of everything combined made him a really, really solid backup catcher. It may depend on how much the Orioles want to use Adley Rutschman behind the plate next year, how much they feel he's gotten over whatever happened to him in the second half of this year. I would definitely target to bring back McCann for at least one more season until you're ready to kind of fully deploy Samuel Basallo behind the dish regularly, probably more likely in 2026. But just kind of a cool, very minor move, but something that can make you smile about baseball for David Banuelos to be back in this Orioles clubhouse. But two more guys to talk about who, at least for now, did not get another minor league deal. That's Nick Maton and Tucker Davidson. We'll talk about the chances after they became free agents that the Orioles could try to bring them back for some depth in 2025. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by Game Time. Now, Game Time, Game Time. It's an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time app, well, they actually go down the closer it gets to first pitch, with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee. Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets. Now, unfortunately, we won't be buying any more Orioles tickets until next spring, but doesn't mean you can't experience all Game Time has to offer. They've got Game Time picks. They've got curation, which makes it easier to save on sports, on concerts, on comedy, on theater. Hey, you want to take a little break from sports outside the baseball season? You can still get tickets to all those amazing events at Game Time. And they've got all-in pricing. If you turn this feature on, it shows the total upfront. There's no surprise fees at checkout. So take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets and more with Game Time picks. And download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. And today's episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by Prize Picks. What's Prize Picks? Well, Prize Picks is the best place to get real money sports action. With over 10 million members and billions of dollars in awarded winnings, Prize Picks has made daily fantasy sports accessible to all. All you do to play is pick more or less on at least two players for a shot to win up to 100 times your cash. You can run your game all season long on Prize Picks. You can even win up to 100 times your money on Prize Picks, and it only takes 4 correct picks. That's right, just 4 correct picks, win 100 times your money. Seems like a pretty good deal to me, and it takes like 60 seconds to put your entry in. It is so fast, and you get your money in as quick as 15 minutes as well. So how do you play? Well, you download the app today, and you use code LOCKEDONMLB to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Again, download the Prize Picks app today and use code LOCKEDONMLB to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That is at Prize Picks. Run your game. So we're going to close things out here talking about a couple of Orioles who have elected free agency here in October, them being Nick Maton and Tucker Davidson, both guys who spent the majority of this year in AAA Norfolk in their first year in the Orioles organization, but each at least played a small part with the Major League Orioles. Let's start with Nick Maton, who did elect free agency after he was DFA'd by the Orioles late in the season. Maton had 2 stints with the O's this year in Major League Baseball, was up very briefly in June. That was right after Juan Soto collided with Jordan Westburg in that weird play between the O's and the Yankees. Maton came up just to make sure Westburg was going to be okay. And then Maton came back in September because, the Orioles were dealing with all those injuries. You had Arias and Westburg and Mountcastle all out in the infield, and you were figuring out ways to combine Emmanuel Rivera and Livan Soto and Nick Maton and turn that into a passable lineup. And Maton came up, ended up playing in 5 games this year, started 2, went 0 for 5 with 2 strikeouts at the Major League level for the 28-year-old veteran. Been around. He's been with the Phillies and the Tigers, played the playoffs, the Major League level, but he was really good in AAA this year. Had a 117 WRC plus and about 350 plate appearances for the Norfolk Tides. And again, actually, he's only 27. He can play everywhere. He can second base, shortstop, third base, left field, right field. If you had to put him at first, you had to put him in center, you could. He's really a true utility guy hitting from the left side of the plate who's been on successful teams before. And I would absolutely be willing to give him another minor league deal with an invite to spring training. Now, Maton actually came over to the Orioles on waivers last offseason, so it was a little bit different how he got to the team. And then he was DFA, but he stayed in the organization. I wouldn't be offering him a major league deal. Like you look at the infield going into next year, and with Westburg and Henderson and Holiday and Arias and Mateo and Kobe Mayo and potentially Mountcastle and O'Hearn all around that infield, there's not a lot of space, and that's without even mentioning Livan Soto and Emmanuel Rivera, who, I could probably see them getting cut loose this offseason, but they're both currently on the 40-man roster, so at least here in October, you have to factor those two in as well. Not a lot of space for Nick Maton try and find a major league job on opening day, let alone at any point next season. So even if no one across the league offers Maton a major league deal, I wouldn't be surprised if he signed a minor league deal with a different team that at least had a quicker path to getting big league playing time. That would not surprise me at all. But if he's willing to come back and be Norfolk depth, it is really nice to have a guy who's been in the big leagues who could play every position and can handle the bat a little bit. That is nice to have in AAA if you need it. Now, the other guy who has elected free agency at this point is Tucker Davidson, who was also a waiver claim by the Orioles last year, left-handed pitcher who they claimed off waivers from the Royals last offseason, who had kind of been working as a reliever for the Royals and the Angels, the two teams he pitched for most of the 2023 big league season, was a starter prior to that, especially with the Braves. Remember, he started a game in the 2021 World Series because Charlie Morton got injured. But for Davidson, when he came over, I really liked the splitter he had from the left side. You don't see that from a lot of lefties, and it had nasty stuff. And the Orioles decided to turn him back into a starter, and ended up being a really good decision because he was huge, at the very least, eating some innings for the Norfolk Tides this year. He threw about 116 innings for Norfolk, had a 3.89 ERA for the left-hander in AAA this year, 21% strikeout rate, 9% walk rate, 46% ground ball rate, all good numbers from the left-hander Davidson. And I really, really like that slider-splitter combination. Even if, he throws two fastballs, the sinker and the four-seamer, they both sit around 91 miles an hour, so it's not a fastball, even from a lefty, that's going to blow you away. But he did have some trouble commanding his splitter at times. That's why he only threw it 12% of the time in those 116 innings in AAA this year. But when he threw it, opponents hit just 153 with a 36% swing and miss rate against that left-handed splitter. That is a weapon pitch for him to have, and he needs to continue to hone that thing because it is very, very nasty. And I think the best thing for Davidson was, I thought throughout the year, I was never banging on the table clamoring you got to call up Tucker Davidson right now, but I was always kind of in his corner, and I was surprised it took as long as it did for him to get a call up. I thought at some point the O's would kind of pull the trigger on him and call him up because he was pitching so well and had major league experience. But he helped the Orioles in kind of a different way. That Friday night against the Twins, the final series of the year, they clinched everything up. They got their playoff spot. They clinched up the number one wild card. So they had nothing to play for in the final two regular season games in Minnesota. The Twins were eliminated, so truly those games meant nothing. And the Orioles knew they were going to be in the wild card series with the season ending Sunday and that series starting Tuesday. You didn't want to burn any of your most important pitchers in those last two games. So you need kind of a bulk guy to come up from AAA and eat innings. And they called up Tucker Davidson to do just that in that Saturday game. And he did an awesome job. Do not overlook how he was able to keep the Orioles' arms rested. And that's one of the reasons that even after Zach Eflin only pitched 4 innings in game 2 of the wildcard series, the Orioles bullpen came in and was fantastic in 5 innings and kept the O's in that game against the Royals. Unfortunately, they only scored 1 run and lost. But one of the reasons was that Tucker Davidson threw 4 2/3 scoreless innings, 4 hits, a K, and 2 walks in that game on Saturday where he didn't start, but Matt Bowman was the opener, and then Davidson came in as the bulk guy in that game, and he kind of saved all those other arms in game 161, and the stuff looked good. He threw a lot of sliders and splitters, kind of stayed away from the fastball, and I don't think Tucker Davidson's one of the Orioles' 5 starting pitchers to begin next year, but if he's willing to do it, and I don't know if another team would give him a major league deal, so I would be pushing hard to get Davidson back to Baltimore on a minor league deal with a big league spring training invite for next year, because I think there is still more to unpack, more in the tank with that stuff he has from the left side. At worst, he would be amazing depth at AAA. And unlike Maton, who I think, again, his ceiling would be AAA depth, I think if you do bring Davidson back on a minor league deal, his ceiling is maybe making this team in the bullpen out of spring training. That's how much I believe in that stuff. And at the very least, if he doesn't make the team initially, at some point being at least an up-down contributing part of the Orioles pitching staff in 2025. That's not out of the question at all. I would be very interested if I am Mike Elias on offering a nice minor league deal with a nice little roster bonus to Tucker Davidson to get him to Sarasota in February of next year. And then the final thing I just got to say on this episode is that it was reported, I believe Matt Wayrich had it of the Baltimore Sun and others, this week John Angelos is officially no longer involved with the Orioles organization in any way. That is some fantastic news to end a podcast with. But we will be back tomorrow. We're talking Gold Glove. The Gold Glove finalists were announced on Tuesday. Ryan Mountcastle and Colton Cowser are the Orioles' 2 finalists. Now, the Gold Glove awards are kind of a sham, but I'll talk about the chances of both of those guys winning those awards at their positions, and if anyone from the O's got snubbed from being a Gold Glove finalist. That is coming up on tomorrow's episode. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.